Call the hearing of Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee to order. In February, we heard from witnesses about the housing challenges that families in their communities face. We heard that more than 2/3 of families aren't able to buy a typical new home. We heard about how local exclusionary zoning policies, from minimum lot size to parking requirements, combined with process delays to shut out new construction or to make it more expensive. We heard about rising costs facing renters, especially working class renters, how few homes are available for them, including in rural areas. We heard about the need to repair the homes we already have by making them safer, more efficient, more accessible for families, including seniors. We've been hearing about these challenges for years, not just from renters and homeowners, but from community leaders and businesses. Because a shortage of affordable housing isn't just a housing problem, it's an education problem, it's a healthcare problem, it's an economic growth problem. In Ohio, I've heard from mayors and sheriffs and police officers from Lancaster to Grove City to Lima that first responders who work in these communities want to live there but can't. That makes it hard to recruit and retain the kind of young, diverse talent they need to keep their communities working and keep them safe. In Cleveland, a coalition ranging from hospitals to schools to community groups have banded together on an innovative education investment campaign to prevent lead poisoning, as Mr. Tisler knows. As new jobs come to Central Ohio, everyone from mayors to the CEOs of more than 80 of the largest institutions in the region are talking about the need to invest in affordable housing to attract and support workers. These challenges play out in every state. Our constituents call on us to address them. Today's hearing will start examining proposals to make housing more affordable, safer, and easier to find. We'll work toward finding common ground and common sense solutions this committee can advance. I'd like to cite a few of those. Many members on both sides have put forward ideas. Ranking Member Scott's road to housing proposal, I assume he'll touch on it today. It includes Senator Coons, Senator Kramer. Thank you for that. Choice and Affordable Housing Act, which aims to get more landlords involved in the voucher program. We recognize the challenges there. Senators Van Hollen and Young have authored the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act to help support low-income families, including families who want to move to areas with better schools and more job opportunities. Senator Cortez Masto has put forward a reauthorization of the Home Investment Partnerships program to help state and communities address our nation's changing housing needs. A number of members off this committee who have developed proposals too. That includes Senator Casey, who's been working on a proposal to address blighted properties, drive community revitalization, and support affordable housing development by supporting and strengthening local land banks. I've been working with Senator Casey and Senator Collins on the Grand Family Housing Act, which would support the housing needs of grandparents who become the primary caregivers for their grandchildren. Includes Senator Bennett, who led our bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act to help prevent unnecessary evictions and the harm that's caused when children and parents are suddenly uprooted, often by private equity firms, and have no place to call home. And Senator Schatz and Collins, who authored the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act to help our country better recover from the increasing number of natural disasters facing communities across the country. In addition to today's hearing, next week, Senator Smith from this committee from Minnesota and Senator Lemus, also from this committee from Wyoming, will hold a hearing on the unique housing challenges facing rural communities, another important part of this discussion. Work to address our housing shortage isn't just limited to this committee. The Finance Committee is also discussing, where Senator Scott and I both sit, is also discussing important proposals like the Affordable Housing Credit Improvements Act and the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that, along with proposals out of this committee, could help support more affordable housing development for homeowners and renters. We don't agree on every idea, but today's hearing is an important step as we continue our work to build consensus on legislation that can address the many challenges facing people. I want to thank Ranking Member Scott and the members today. We came to agreement on a fentanyl bill that we've talked to Senator Rounds. Senator Reeds is a co-sponsor already, Senator Tester, and a number of our colleagues on your side of the aisle. What we're able to do in this housing is really important in a bipartisan way. Senator Scott.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining the fentanyl bill that we all should focus on as it relates to stopping fentanyl from killing 70,000 more Americans as we see our southern border unsafe, insecure, and wide open. And the impact that it's having on Americans is undeniable and measured in the number of deaths that we're seeing across the border. On April 11th, we celebrated the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, a triumph for civil rights by outlawing discrimination in housing. While it's important to celebrate these victories, we can't turn a blind eye to progress. It's our responsibility to consider whether progress has been indeed made or if we need to switch gears and critically rethink how we deliver on these goals. Unfortunately, our housing policies are not resulting in the true benefits and advancements that our hardest hit families deserve. Despite spending trillions of dollars on subsidies for affordable housing, the home ownership rates for minorities haven't changed since a couple years after the Housing Act was passed, an unacceptable reality. And on top of that, we have all seen the rise in homelessness over the last several years, despite spending more money on homelessness programs than ever before. Something is clearly not working. Additionally, HUD research tells us that the average length of stay for families across all HUD-assisted housing programs has nearly doubled since 1995 through 2015. Federal programs are meant to transition people out of poverty, not keep them in poverty. How long before we realize that throwing more money on solutions that aren't working is a problem, particularly for those residents living in government-assisted housing? We need a more thoughtful, opportunity-building solution than we're working on so far. Should we continue to double down on last century's policies that seemingly failed to solve last century's problems? The answer is obviously no. In fact, it's time for a new approach, an approach that gives Americans who have lost hope a roadmap to opportunity and prosperity, one that combines proven bipartisan policies with new solutions. I'm introducing a discussion draft of my legislation, the Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream, or Road to Housing Act. Before we dive into some of the policies we are considering in this legislation, I have a few requests to make. For the witnesses with us today, sharing your expertise and all other stakeholders working to make the American dream a reality for those who today seem to think that it's elusive or unachievable, I would love your expertise as we craft legislation and keep it as a part of the road to the American dream. I ask for your input. To the other senators here today, I ask that all of us would put aside, whether we're on the left or the right, and think about helping more Americans achieve the American dream. The American public who might be watching with us today, all 35 of those watching C-SPAN, hoping to find a path towards prosperity. I've said this before, that success is created not here in Washington in hearing rooms, but actually they're typically created in apartments and in garages and at kitchen tables and in classrooms across this great nation. Let's craft laws and policies that help pave the pathway to home ownership. The Road to Housing Act introduces new and needed reforms across all sectors of our housing market. These proposals are meant to be a departure from the stale partisan ideas that have defined our debates over federal housing policy in recent years. For families looking to buy a home or struggling to stay in one, my legislation will increase access to high-quality housing counseling and financial literacy programs. For families in rural America, it will provide access to housing that suits your needs. For families in search of entry-level and affordable housing, it will encourage the construction and financing of lower-cost homes. For families in public housing, it will empower program administrators to provide better tailored support and encourage access to private capital, keeping your homes safe and healthy. For those who don't have a place to call home, it will ensure that federal homelessness programs and funding pays for results, rewarding communities or programs who have made progress with helping their homeless. And for taxpayers, it will ensure that the federal agencies spending your hard-earned dollars are doing so effectively and with accountability. Though I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses as they consider the legislation, we must also acknowledge that the housing problems we face are broader than this committee's jurisdiction. A lack of supply, the cost of complying with government regulations, and a shortage of workers all contribute to the shortage of affordable housing. So as this legislation develops, we will look forward to having a conversation about innovative solutions for the broader challenges that we face. I hope that we can call all of us to the table to address the housing challenges our country faces. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you. One final note. Homes and communities aren't built without hard work. So after making requests from everyone else in this room, I want to make a promise myself to consistently stay at the table, making sure that housing affordability is not a hearing, but a theme that permeates throughout the entire year.
Thank you, Senator Scott. I'll introduce today's witnesses. Lou Tisler, Executive Director of the National NeighborWorks Association, served as the Director of the Housing Counseling Network for the National Community Reinvestment Corporation, led a Cleveland NeighborWorks affiliate where he worked at the height of the financial crisis, helping Ohio families save their homes, and is a resident of Rocky River, Ohio. Welcome, Lou. Mr. Tisler. Vanessa Calder is the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at Cato. Prior to joining Cato, she was the Staff Director of the Joint Economic Committee. Ms. Calder, welcome. Diane Yentel is the President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Previously was Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners and Director of the Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division at HUD. Welcome back, Ms. Yentel. Mr. Tisler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and the members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss building consensus to address our nation's housing challenges. National NeighborWorks Association, or NNA, is a trade association for NeighborWorks America chartered organizations with almost 250 organizations across the country in every state, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and tribal lands. Our members provided over $10 billion of affordable housing as well as community and economic development in FY22. This impact reflects the leveraging of $65 for every $1 of federally appropriated funds to NeighborWorks America. The flexibility of these funds allows for locally driven solutions for place-based challenges. Larger national housing challenges are upon us now. We ask that this body find consensus to address these challenges soon. There is not one silver bullet to address all the housing challenges faced across our nation. These challenges span all income levels, impacting everyone, having an increasing negative impact to those at or below the area median income. These challenges span all areas, not just urban areas, but also middle neighborhoods, entering suburbs, rural areas, and tribal lands. These challenges span all racial demographics, having much more negative impact on our communities of color. And they span many occupations: first responders, essential workers, teachers, nurses, and a whole host of others. What are the possibilities of federal solutions? My written testimony speaks to a wide spectrum of housing stock needs, from increasing housing supply to repairing existing housing stock to addressing blighted housing whose removal would be of community benefit. This body, as well as the entire Congress, should build consensus solutions that lead to successfully addressing our nation's housing challenges. These solutions could address access to capital through community development finance legislation that would effectively increase and improve housing stock. The Community Development Finance Caucus, a prime example of moving in a bipartisan way to find access to capital solutions. Other challenges needed to be addressed are generating solutions for manufactured housing challenges that affect rural, suburban, and even urban areas. Jumpstarting neighborhood revitalization through a national land banking program, as well as increasing funding to NeighborWorks America. Supporting and replicating effective repair programming, such as the Whole Homes Repair Program in Pennsylvania. Revisiting rules and regulations related to current federal funding, cutting red tape to make these programs more effective and efficient while ensuring safe and healthy housing. Opportunity zones should increase the incorporation of private investment to spur greater production and rehabilitation of affordable housing, relying on this increasing private investment to lead the value proposition of opportunity zones. Supporting and enhancing shared equity programs like community land trusts and resident-owned communities. Working closely with the Senate Committee on Ag to create capacity building and housing synergies through the reauthorization of the Farm Bill. and leveraging the impact and success of HUD-certified counseling to create new homeowners, successful renters, and financially resilient residents. We know that the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, or Neighborhood Homes, is not in the jurisdiction of this committee, though it is a shining example of creating a pathway to successful, consensus-based, bipartisan, bicameral solutions to a national housing strategy. We know from past experience broad consensus works, whether here on Capitol Hill or between our partners at the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Realtors, and the National Home Builders Association, between organizations like NNA, NeighborWorks America, the National Housing Conference, the Housing Assistance Council, Grounded Solutions Network, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, and a host of others, including my colleagues here today. We know broad-based consensus works. To be successful in addressing our nation's housing challenges, the urgency of consensus is now. Working together and addressing our nation's housing challenges will show the American people that there are achievable solutions for our neighborhoods, for our communities, and for our country. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in building consensus to address our nation's housing challenges. I look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you, Ms. Tisler. Ms. Brown Calder, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. Thank you for convening this hearing. My name is Vanessa Brown Calder, and I am the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at Cato Institute. In my role at Cato, I focus on policies that support family and increase opportunity with a special focus on housing. Housing continues to function as a gateway to economic, educational, and social opportunities for millions of Americans. When housing is abundant, it is more affordable. Affordable housing provides a pathway to better jobs and a better education. It allows individuals to be part of the communities that they desire. On the other hand, when housing supply is limited, housing prices rise and opportunity declines. Today, America has an acute housing imbalance and continuing affordability challenges. Although a variety of factors are relevant, federal and local policy is unfortunately substantially to blame. State and local regulatory constraints on housing supply have limited supply in many places for many years. Zoning and land use regulation continues to limit housing supply by increasing development costs, creating uncertainty, and producing delays. These regulations limit nearly every aspect of development. They subject housing development to lengthy review processes with many veto points. Together, these regulations effectively freeze pre-existing development in place, which makes it difficult to build new homes or accommodate new residents. A large volume of academic research ties land use regulations to high housing prices. A well-known paper finds that zoning regulations pushed up the cost of apartments by around 50% in Manhattan, San Francisco, and San Jose. A recent paper reviewing 24 metropolitan areas finds a massive zoning tax of up to $500,000 per quarter acre in cities with restrictive land use regimes. The importance of housing supply becomes quickly evident when contrasting the outcomes of homeless policy initiatives across Utah, California, and Houston, Texas. All three locations have adopted housing-first policies which emphasize the need for permanent housing before tackling other issues such as mental health problems or substance use disorder. Despite their commitment to providing the homeless with housing, only Houston, a place lacking a traditional zoning code with a pro-development culture and responsive housing supply, has been able to significantly reduce homelessness under this policy. As one other example of policy limiting housing supply, federal lands policy severely limits the supply of available land for housing in western states that have experienced substantial recent in-migration. In western states like Nevada, Utah, and Idaho, the federal government owns most of the land. A recent study finds that a reform that would allow local governments to purchase just 0.1% of federal land holdings could lead to the construction of approximately 2.7 million new homes. Although housing programs are often the focus of housing affordability conversations, underlying housing affordability problems will not be fixed through subsidies for rent and home ownership. 5.2 million households use federal rental assistance, but there are over 41 million cost-burdened or severely cost-burdened households and 62 million low-income renters in the United States. Even generously expanding existing programs or creating new ones would still only reach a fraction of renters and homeowners experiencing affordability issues. Although housing subsidies will not solve widespread housing affordability issues, there are nonetheless opportunities to improve existing housing programs. These improvements should be made with an eye towards increasing effectiveness, innovation, and human flourishing. Senator Scott's proposal to reward effective homeless initiatives, allow greater experimentation, reduce regulation, and allow the continuing conversion of public housing to voucher assistance are all common sense reforms that should be seriously considered by both sides. Furthermore, existing housing programs that are ineffective or poorly targeted to the poor should be repurposed or eliminated. For instance, research indicates that the benefits of the low-income housing tax credit flow primarily to developers rather than low-income tenants. In general, directing subsidies to the lowest income people constitutes the most compassionate, effective, and economically efficient approach. The goal of housing policy should not be to increase spending and expand programs. It should be to radically improve existing housing policy, housing supply, and affordability. Then Americans of all stripes will have the pride of standing on their own 2 feet and the opportunity to achieve their dreams. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Calling Ms. Yentel. Welcome.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Housing costs are out of reach for too many of the lowest income renters in America. Rents are far higher than what the lowest income and most marginalized people, including seniors, people with disabilities, and working families, can pay. Despite the clear and urgent need, Congress provides funding for housing assistance for only 1 in 4 eligible households. And while removing restrictions on local zoning are important, subsidies are necessary to make homes affordable for extremely low-income households, as my written testimony describes at length. In the absence of affordable housing, 10 million of the lowest income renter households pay at least half of their limited income on rent, leaving them without the resources they need to put food on the table, purchase needed medications, or otherwise make ends meet. Paying so much on rent leaves the lowest income families always one financial emergency or unexpected expense away from facing eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. For millions of these households, the COVID-19 pandemic was that financial shock. The pandemic and accompanying economic hardship put as many as 12 million households at risk of losing their homes without immediate government action. Federal, state, and local governments responded to the warnings of housing advocates and impacted people with unprecedented resources and protections to keep renters housed and move people experiencing homelessness to safety. Most of these temporary measures were bipartisan, and they significantly reduced housing instability and unnecessary suffering during the pandemic. But as protections expire and emergency resources are depleted, the lowest income renters are now struggling more than ever. The pandemic's negative impact on employment and income, followed by severe rent and other inflation, worsened an affordable housing crisis that was already acute. Between 2019 and 2021, the gap in affordable and available rental homes for the lowest income renters grew from 6.8 million to 7.3 million, leaving these renters with even fewer places to turn. And as rents increased, so too did homelessness in many communities. The U.S. Government Accountability Office has found that a $100 per month median increase in rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness in that same community. And over the last 2 years, rents increased by nearly $200 per month. Congress must increase investments in long-term solutions to the pervasive and long-standing shortage of affordable, accessible homes, including by making rental assistance universally available to all eligible households in need, preserving and expanding the supply of homes affordable to people with the lowest incomes, providing resources to prevent evictions and homelessness, and strengthening and enforcing renter protections. So we likely can't achieve all this during this Congress. We have more work to do to build political will for comprehensive solutions. But thankfully, there are bipartisan bills with strong bipartisan support among the public that can and should be advanced that could ensure more extremely low-income families are safely and stably housed and fewer face eviction and homelessness. So we urge this committee and this Congress to quickly advance bipartisan housing bills that would have a measurable impact on the housing crisis. Bills such as the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act to provide 250,000 new housing choice vouchers for families with young children. The Eviction Crisis Act to continue the success of the bipartisan ERA programs, and other bipartisan bills to improve and streamlining existing housing programs, build housing for people with the lowest incomes, improve oversight of federal disaster resources, and increase access to fair and affordable housing. Rents have skyrocketed. Eviction filings are rising and surpassing pre-pandemic levels. Homelessness is increasing. The country's lowest income people are struggling to stay housed, and Congress's inaction costs us all. But quick bipartisan action by this Congress can, just as it did during the pandemic, save lives, save money, and provide housing relief for many. I urge this committee and this Congress to act quickly and, at minimum, advance the multitude of bipartisan housing bills before us. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel. Start with you. In the previous two Congresses, I co-sponsored the Eviction Crisis Act with Senator Bennett, Democrat Senators Young, and my former colleague from Ohio, Senator Portman. Too many seniors and families are one car repair, one sick child, sudden job loss away from being evicted and having their educations, jobs, and lives turned upside down. How would the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act help? Walk through that for us.
So two main ways. One, through creating a national database on evictions. The more reliable public data there is on evictions and evictors, the better federal, state, and local policymakers can create and implement solutions to lessen evictions. The other is through creating a permanent program to provide cash assistance to low-income households who otherwise can make ends meet, to absorb an unexpected financial shock that can otherwise lead to eviction and a spiraling down into poverty with all of its associated costs to kids, communities, and the country. And so even before the pandemic in 2019, there was bipartisan understanding and agreement that an emergency rental assistance-like program could save money and provide housing stability for millions of families. And certainly then the pandemic came and we had our pilot program. Over 500 emergency rental assistance programs stood up throughout the country. The program has been very successful. Nearly 11 million payments have been made, and it's kept millions of families stably housed. It lowered the eviction filing rate to the lowest on record. So the Eviction Crisis Act would build off of these lessons learned and this success to create a permanently authorized program to help assist families before they reach the point of eviction and homelessness with all of its associated costs.
Thank you. You speak eloquently of the necessity for this, understanding that so many people that are evicted have jobs, in many cases too minimum wage, barely above minimum wage jobs, and this is a time when Congress bipartisanly can act. Thank you for that. Mr. Tisler, many older homes need repairs to help save money in utility bills, to eliminate hazards like lead and mold, to make them accessible for seniors. You've been a real leader on that issue in our part of Ohio. In Cleveland and other areas, a lot of homes built before 1978. When I go to East Palestine that suffered from that train derailment, overwhelming number of homes are over 40 or 50 years old. Addressing lead in these homes can be especially important for health and safety. We're fortunate in Cleveland to have the Lead Safe Cleveland Coalition, which has formed an innovative multi-sector effort to prevent lead poisoning. We need to do more. How would improvements to the home program, Senator Cortez Masto on this committee has been a leader in this. How would improvements in that program and a program funding comprehensive home repairs help you do this work?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. And definitely, the Lead Safe Cleveland Coalition is something that should be replicated across the country in terms of bringing hospitals together, corporations, and community people, and being able to access that kind of funding. But in terms of the home program, what we would really like to do is to be able to get more people to access that in terms of rehabilitation and homeownership. But looking at the home program, and then also the whole homes program that is happening in Pennsylvania, being able to layer that on to address issues such as health and safety, especially lead. Lead, my previous office was in the Slavic Village area where numerous homes, probably 95% of them were built before 1978. And the lead issue affects education, it affects health, it affects economic development. And being able to look at the home program and being able to access that, to be able to make sure that it has ease of regulation, to be able to have community development corporations access that, to have municipalities be able to make that happen. In terms of what Senator Cortez Masto is looking at in terms of the home program, is following that reauthorization and her recommendations to make sure that the home program is able to be used for home repair as opposed to sitting on the sideline not being engaged.
Thank you, and I appreciate your work in Slavic Village. I think my wife and I live about a mile from where you're talking in Cleveland. Last question, Ms. Yentel. We've had witnesses across the political spectrum testify that exclusionary zoning and other local barriers limit housing supply and raise the cost of housing. Would you support efforts to help communities reduce local barriers to housing, or are these efforts sufficient to make housing affordable for low-income workers and people on fixed incomes?
Absolutely support efforts. Restrictive local zoning is a real challenge in many communities. It inhibits the construction of any kind of apartments, and especially affordable apartments. It drives up costs for everybody, and it reinforces segregation and racial inequities. So state and local governments should do much more to remove restrictive local zoning ordinances, and the federal government should do more to incentivize or require them to do so. But even when and if these restrictive local zoning ordinances are lifted, housing will not be affordable to extremely low-income households because the private market on its own can't build and operate apartments that are affordable to them because the rent they can afford to pay doesn't cover the costs. This is a basic market failure that requires government intervention in the form of subsidies such as rental assistance, public housing, or other types of ways to make homes, to bridge that gap between what the lowest income people can afford and what rent costs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thinking about the concept that sometimes we think more spending somehow leads to better help for families, and that certainly doesn't seem to be true without reforms to the programs that we have. I think about the fact that in New York City, their housing authority, one of America's largest housing authorities, we see that 1 in 5 public housing residents remain in its programs for more than 40 years. Does not sound like the road to the American dream to me. 20% of the residents, the New York City's housing authority programs, are there for 4 decades. That sounds like cycles and cycles of folks living in public housing. Can't be good for them, and certainly not good for anyone else. So I welcome a discussion on how we figure this out and moving forward. Think about the fact that when you think that money is the only solution to some of the challenges that we face, I think about the fact that during COVID, we spent billions of dollars on housing subsidies. And in addition to that, we typically spend billions of dollars regularly every year from the federal government. Despite this extra spending, or perhaps because of it, housing costs have certainly skyrocketed since 2020. You think about the fact the average sales price of a home has ballooned from $383,000 beginning in 2020 to $535,000 in 2022. Every rational economist would say a 40% increase in the cost of housing cannot be good for people buying houses. Instead of trying to cut back on the regulatory burdens or increase the supply of housing, this administration is dead set on inflating the demand. Examples of this abound, including FHFA's recent actions that will penalize borrowers who have done the right thing, saving for a down payment or increasing their credit scores. At the same time, cost continues to increase. The bureaucracy continues to increase. It's just In just over a decade, HUD's budget has ballooned from $32 billion in FY 2014 to $73 billion in FY 2022. That's almost a 130% increase with very little to show for it. This is a kind of a simple yes or no question I'd love the panel to answer. Does anyone oppose more accountability by our housing regulators administering these costly programs?
Just yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes.
No.
No, we support more accountability.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm sorry. No.
Okay, good.
I needed to think about the question. Sorry about that.
I
Ranking Member
actually-
Scott.
I didn't have a follow-up for someone who says yes, so
No. I was thinking about
didn't know what to do next. This is good.
I was thinking about my 34 family members watching on C-SPAN right now.
This is- I thought it was only 30, so just thank you for hanging out with us today. Inflation, yes, under the Biden administration. Okay, so the Road to Housing Act proposes incremental changes to making housing programs more accountable and grants housing providers needed flexibility to innovate, increase supply, and reduce costs to all families, but in particular, low-income families. How would you improve the legislation, Ms. Calder?
Well, thank you for asking. I appreciate what you've done to move housing policy forward with the Road to Housing Act, both on the innovation side, on the deregulatory side. As you know, there's so much that can be done to improve housing policy. I think one of the things that I would like to see or add sort of to the conversation as an objective for longer-term policy reforms is to continue to build on what the Road to Housing Act does and continue to move from supply side or production side housing subsidies towards tenant-based assistance. So, if we look at programs like, for instance, the low-income housing tax credit, this program tends to be representative of what sort of goes wrong when you support housing through the supply side. As I mentioned in my testimony, the benefits of the low-income housing tax credit primarily flow to developers, which is problematic when you have low income right in the title of the program, and it doesn't seem to be actually flowing to the people that it's intended to support. There's other issues with that program as well in terms of crowd out and other issues along those lines. So I think that's one of the things. And I think another thing that I would like to see longer term is just a move towards interim housing assistance. People sometimes have periods of financial distress, but they don't maybe need permanent housing support. They don't need long-term shelter. They just have a short-term problem and need sort of a way to get patched through during that difficult period.
One more question for you before I run out of time here. The Economic Innovation Group, the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the Treasury Department have shown that the Opportunity Zone investment has been heavily concentrated in our nation's poorest communities. One of the things that we're seeing, however, because of the investments in OZs in those areas, is a jump in about 20% of residential development without seeing the apartment rents in the same areas increase. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of homes in those areas without gentrification, which is a blessing from my perspective. Could you speak to the benefits of harmonizing tax policy and federal government programs so that they work together?
Sure can, and I did notice that EIG study that you mentioned. I think in order to see how important it is to harmonize federal tax policy and federal grant programs, we can look at an instance where it doesn't work, where it didn't work. The state and local tax deduction is one example of this from a housing policy perspective. The state and local tax deduction is capitalized into housing prices in expensive markets on the coast and wealthy, areas on the coast. At the same time, those are often the areas that have the highest levels of regulation. And what I've found in my research is that the areas with the highest levels of regulation also receive the highest per capita HUD subsidies. And so basically what you have are these policies that are sort of working against each other actively. On the one hand, boosting up the cost, the price of housing. On the other hand, you're trying to undo that with subsidies to reduce the cost of housing, and you sort of have a cat chasing its tail type of situation. And so I think that is representative of how important it is to get both the tax policy and the grant making right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Rhode Island's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Yentel, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness is the only federal agency that is exclusively devoted to alleviating homelessness. And unlike most federal agencies, it terminates if it's not renewed. So Senator Collins and I are trying to renew it so that it can continue to serve. Could you talk a little bit about the work of this agency, how important it is?
Sure. The USICH coordinates the federal approach to ending homelessness among 19 federal agencies. It works together with federal, state, and local governments, with the private sector to coordinate resources, to coordinate response, to implement best practices, evidence-based best practices, and really to streamline the response and ensure that all of the resources are pooled in a way that's used most effectively, most efficiently, and to advance evidence-based best practices.
So your conclusion would be that it really saves taxpayers' money and efficient use of taxpayers' dollars.
It does. It's an important agency that should certainly continue.
And I'm told the cost of, well, this year's funding is $4 million, which is seems to be a reasonable investment in such efficiency. Do you concur?
Right. The funding is primarily for the staff that are working closely with all the federal agencies, with federal, state, and local policymakers to do this important work.
Mr. Tisler, if I may, FHA's Title I program allows homeowners to receive FHA-insured loans to fund home renovations, but there's very little take-up because the loan limits are so low, it's ignored. Would increasing loan limits help low and moderate income homeowners pay for still very needed repairs and renovations?
Yep. Senator Reed, definitely. In terms of looking at our membership, in terms of getting involved in home repair and rehabilitation, raising those loan limits are very key in terms of being able to access that. People are living on the edge now in terms of what their debt-to-income ratios are and things along those lines, and they can't be able to access enough funds to address what's happening. I mean, when you look at supply side and you look at what the cost of a hot water tank or a furnace, it's gone incrementally, exponentially higher, and increasing those loans to be able to do repairs is key to be able to sustain homes into the future.
It also might trigger some of the tax incentives that are built in now for home energy efficiencies, which would be sort of a double benefit. The other aspect of this is that accessory dwelling units is the term of art, but with the affordable home crisis so critical, many people looking for in-law apartments or other facilities, and this loan program could help with that.
Definitely, in terms of ADUs or accessible dwelling units, what we would like to see is being able to look at that flow of income as part of the loan application. We're going to see an incredible need of housing for seniors coming up very soon, and ADUs could be one of those tools in the toolbox to be able to make that happen. So being able to include those, because a lot of times people say structure, and they mean the house, and you really don't take into account the ADU. So being able to look at that and being able to make loans to homeowners who are putting up ADUs is going to increase that supply.
Thank you. Just a final question, Mr. Tisler. CoreLogic reports that investors, private equity, et cetera, are acquiring 26% of single-family homes sold at the end of 2022. I find that somewhat disturbing. It seems to be entirely disruptive of not only the local housing market, but the real estate market, the legal market that operates, et cetera. And I've heard also concerns that one tactic is to buy the homes, evict the tenant, and then sell it or rent it to a higher level, which is not the typical behavior of single families that rent homes or even small local companies.
Senator, the institutional investors who are being involved in this are really limiting the supply of homes and rental units that are available, and really looking to try to capitalize. And I understand that capitalism is about capitalizing, but what they are doing is buying these homes, perhaps putting in a new ceiling fan and saying, renovated, we're going to jack your rent $300. It is unseemingly happening across communities across the country. It is the new investment vehicle to really improve shareholder wealth. And it is not helping the American people's wealth and wealth creation. So anything that this committee or this Congress can do to limit that would be welcome across our 250 organizations.
I concur. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your passion. Mr. Tisler, do you think the federal government should be making it more expensive to build affordable housing?
Absolutely not, sir.
Okay. Well, it is. To build a home, of course, I think we can agree on this, requires money. And the people who loan that money, of course, expect to be paid back. And they expect to protect their collateral, which is the affordable home. The mortgagee, or the person who loans the money, oftentimes requires that the homeowner carry insurance. Can we agree on that?
Yes, sir.
And more, the mortgagee, the person loaning the money, requires the homeowner to carry flood insurance. Yet, while you are here advocating, as we all are, for affordable housing, our federal government, through FEMA, is working as hard as it can to increase the cost of flood insurance. FEMA hired a company called Milliman to write a new algorithm, which Milliman says can look at every individual home in the United States and predict its flood risk over the next 30 years. Amazing. There's just one problem. They won't share with anyone the algorithm. And as a result of that algorithm, national flood insurance costs have gone, I'll give you the national figure, from $808 to $1,808. Now, I'll give you some concrete examples. In my state, we call counties parishes. St. Mary Parish, the median household income is $40,000 roughly. The new flood insurance rate in St. Mary Parish is $5,226 a year as a result of FEMA's actions. That doesn't include homeowners. That doesn't include property taxes. That doesn't include liability insurance. That's flood. Now, how can you build an affordable home for someone when they have to pay half of the cost of the home, when you add up all this insurance they have to carry, in insurance?
Senator, I can't speak to FEMA because I don't know how they arrive at that.
Yes, but I guess that was an unfair question. Why aren't the three of you, I'm not criticizing you, I may make this a general suggestion. Why don't you take a look at what FEMA's doing to the cost of building an affordable home in America? because you're not going to have any. There's no free lunch, and you don't get one now. I mean, they're making it impossible to build affordable housing in America. And I think the three of you respectfully ought to take a look at that and the impact on affordable housing in our country. Ms. Yentel, you did I say your name right?
It's Yentel. Thank you.
Yentel, I'm sorry. You talked about zoning. Let's take California, for example. I don't mean to pick on California. I love California. It's a beautiful state. It's very expensive to own a home there. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
So people, when they buy a home, working people, poor and middle class, not many people poor can afford to buy a home, it costs so much that their home becomes their 401k. They can't save anything. I mean, they have to put the money into equity in their home. And so they want to protect the value of that home. And they communicate that to their elected officials. So their elected officials, despite what they say, make it very difficult through their zoning decisions to build affordable housing. Despite their left of center politics. Isn't that what's going on?
That's absolutely true. And California is a prime example of what happens when very restrictive local zoning ordinances prevent the construction of any type of housing, multifamily housing, and especially affordable housing. And the result is that it drives up costs for everyone, and it certainly squeezes the lowest income renters the most. But California is not alone. This is a pattern that
No, but it's the best example, isn't it?
It is a prime example, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Kennedy. Senator Menendez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Yentel, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's 2022 Out of Reach report showed just how hard it is for low-income renters to afford even modest housing. In my home state of New Jersey, for which, by the way, we have something called the Mount Laurel decision and a whole host of others, so we don't have that exclusionary zoning that my colleague was talking about, a median income renter is barely able to pay for a one-bedroom home. The fact is that there just aren't enough rental homes being built, and part of that is because federal lending programs through HUD and the Federal Housing Administration haven't kept pace with the market. So, Ms. Yentel, is it true that FHA's multifamily loan limits haven't been adjusted since 2003?
That's true.
That's 20 years. Is it also true that even after adjustments for inflation and higher cost areas, FHA multifamily financing isn't a viable financing tool in many parts of the country?
In many parts, yes, that's true.
Would you say these limits pose a challenge to HUD and FHA meeting its mission to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing?
I would.
That's why I introduced a discussion draft for today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, that would modernize FHA's ability to finance multifamily housing construction around the country. It's a simple, common-sense proposal that would update FHA's lending ability to accurately reflect the increase in construction costs over the past 20 years. So we look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, to empower FHA to meet this one challenge. Now, flooding is one of the most frequent and most expensive natural disasters impacting homes in the United States, but just 4% of Americans have a flood insurance policy. Ms. Yentel, isn't it true that low-income families disproportionately face increased flood risk?
Yes, lower income communities and often predominantly communities of color are often located in low-lying areas that are susceptible to flooding. And mitigation dollars and disaster recovery dollars are often not provided to these communities, sort of continuing a legacy of disinvestment in these lower income communities of color.
And
so
what
they
does
don't
that-
have the infrastructure that they need.
And what does that mean for uninsured or underinsured working families and their disaster recovery?
It means that they don't have the infrastructure they need to prevent or mitigate the effects of flooding. And then when flooding occurs, often the resources are diverted to other communities. I would add, too, that there is a large number of subsidized housing, about 450,000 units of HUD-subsidized housing that are located in flood-prone areas. and some of them are located in areas that repeatedly flood. So this not only puts low-income people in harm's way, but it costs the government more over time to continuously repair the damages from floods.
Now, FEMA has long struggled to keep premiums affordable, but it appears that the NFIP's new rating methodology called Risk Rating 2.0 has only made flood insurance more out of reach for working and middle-class families. In Paterson, New Jersey, where the median household income is $50,000 a year, 180 homeowners will see their premiums increase from an average of $1,500 a year to an average of $4,000 a year. So the cost of flood insurance is tied directly to the affordability of home ownership, especially if your mortgage provider requires coverage, which most do if you're in a floodplain. So I worry many families face an impossible choice of being overburdened with housing costs or foregoing insurance for their most important financial asset, which is their home, which is why I'll be reintroducing my bipartisan NFIP REACT, and I appreciate the chairman's going to be having a hearing on flood insurance, which is critically important. Finally, first responders, teachers, law enforcement, other public service employees are integral to our communities. The pandemic especially provided countless examples of these individuals stepping up when we needed them the most, and in many cases putting themselves at risk to do so. Regrettably, many public service employees are facing rising expenses that are driving them out of their professions. In recent years, we've seen increasing dire shortages of police and teachers, to give a few examples. Mr. Tisler, would a program to make credit-worthy public service employees eligible for a one-time mortgage with no down payment and no mortgage insurance premium make housing more affordable for these individuals?
Senator, being able to make mortgages available to those who have taken care of us is of utmost importance. And when looking at being able to access loans in terms of zero down, low to no interest, it is what we owe those who are stepping up to be able to make that happen. We would be able to see, again, first responders, essential workers, being able to be closer to where they work, to then therefore save money on transportation and other things, childcare, et cetera, if they could buy homes in the areas that they're working in, and we're not seeing that happen now.
Thank you. That's what my Bipartisan Helper Act is, and we look forward to working with the committee on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Tillis from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Calder, on January the 19th, FHFA announced via press release an intent to rewrite single-family pricing framework, which governs the fees and rate pricing structure that the government-sponsored entities, or GSEs, use for the U.S. housing finance system. As it's designed, it looks like these policies would decrease overall cost for riskier individuals with low credit scores, and at the same time, forcibly raise costs and fees for those with better credit scores. Can you speak to the effects that moving away from a risk-based pricing model would have on housing lending?
Yes, happy to try. I think that this rule, it seems to me that it sets up the wrong incentives for folks. Obviously, people save money over time for their down payment. They work hard. They pay their bills on time. And those people under this rule would actually be penalized, which seems like not the right strategy to set up a sure financial footing for our economy, certainly in the housing sector. I think something that concerns me quite a bit is just that we are starting to be in a deflating market. And as a result of that softening market, I think we really should be very careful right now about pulling marginal buyers into the housing market at the right time. We don't want to set those folks that would be stretching and maybe wouldn't be qualified otherwise to take out these loans, take out this mortgage. We don't want to set them up for failure. We don't want to set these folks up for bankruptcy. We don't know if there will be a recession in the near term, short term. but it seems like the wrong time to be making these types of decisions. And I should say also, more broadly, this may be a less popular opinion. I think in the U.S. we have a tendency to sort of romanticize homeownership when the reality is that homeownership isn't right for everybody in every circumstance, and renting can actually be a superior option than as compared to home ownership for many. Home prices can be volatile, and home ownership really is an obstacle to mobility, and you want people to be able to match with jobs and find opportunity and services and amenities and be able to move to places in order to obtain those things.
Just following that vein, despite their press release yesterday, FHFA Director Sandra Thompson said that this rule would increase pricing support for purchase borrowers limited by income or by wealth. Inherently, this means Director Thompson's plan is designed to place Americans into homes they would otherwise struggle to afford. Considering the causes of the subprime loan crisis in 2008 and a recession that followed, is selling people houses they would struggle to afford generally a good idea?
I would say no, not a good idea.
As the U.S. experiences a housing slowdown, do you believe their actions will further dampen the housing market based on the proposed policy?
I don't.
My time remaining, I came in on the tail end of Senator Kennedy's comments. I'm going to submit some questions for the record and end on time. But I've told this story in banking before. I served in the legislature before I came here. I had a meeting with the town in my district, and the meeting was to talk about increasing the supply of affordable housing. It was an hour-long meeting. For the first 45 minutes, we were talking about what we could do to promote affordable housing. And in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, and I agreed with them, we did a lot of work with that when I was in the legislature and actually when I was speaker for 4 years. The last 15 minutes of the meeting was a request. We have what we call local bills to enable towns to do things that are otherwise not allowed in the other towns. Their request for me was to give them the authority to mandate fire suppression systems in all homes being built, $100,000 home. And I told this town council, I said, we've spent 3/4 of this meeting talking about increasing the stock of affordable housing, and you've just made a proposal that would increase the cost of that affordable home by 10 to 15% for the housing price that we're talking about. One of the things we have to do if we're going to get serious about improving the supply of affordable housing is get serious about right-sizing regulations and permitting. And we see with WOTUS, the implementation of WOTUS, it will have an impact on available affordable housing. And if you don't believe me, ask the bipartisan county commissioners about what that's going to do for the length of the time for the inventory to come online and the supply. So I hope as we talk about solutions that we also talk about the impediments that we're creating and the additive effect we're having and the reduction in affordable housing that we have in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Till. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this here, and I want to thank the folks who are testifying, of course. Look, I'm a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. I think there is a role of the government to build houses, but I don't necessarily think the solution is government housing. And as Senator Tillis just pointed out, I think making sure we're cutting red tape when red tape isn't necessary, bringing folks together is really important. For you three, in your opinion, as succinctly as you can you tell me what's the most effective way to boost housing supply? Go ahead, Mr. Tisler.
So I think that to boost housing supply, you really need to look and see what are the needs of the community. It really needs to be bottom-driven in terms of, are we looking at land banks? Are we looking at land trusts? What does the community need and what is viable? And when we look at increasing that supply, it's really coming together and making those regulations less, but still thinking about healthy and safe homes, but decreasing the cost of being able to do that. And so as, Senator Kenny talked about the flood insurance, but there's a host of other insurances and things along those lines. So lowering that cost will increase the supply. It will incentivize home builders to actually build homes in terms of smaller scale that are more affordable than the larger homes, because you need to look at the economies of scale and put that into the cost structure.
Okay?
I guess I would just say very quickly, comprehensive zoning and land use reform is what I think will boost supply the most.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, it can't just be one reform. It can't just be eliminating, let's say, some regulatory constraints around citing accessory dwelling units. It needs to be much broader than that. And the
I'm
reason
talking about what level are we doing it, from the federal level, the state level, or local level?
I think most effective at the state level.
Okay,
So-
keep going. Yeah.
So I would agree that states and localities need to remove restrictive local zoning ordinances that's inhibiting construction of apartments. And the federal government can do more to incentivize or even require states and localities to do that. That will allow the private market to step in and do what it does, which is build and operate apartments that are affordable for middle-income home renters. What it won't do is make housing affordable for very low and extremely low-income households, because the private market on its own can't build and operate apartments that are affordable to extremely low-income households, because the rent that they can pay doesn't cover the costs to build and operate housing. So we should have states and localities do more on restrictive local zoning for middle-income renters, and then provide subsidies to make homes affordable for extremely low-income renters in the form of the National Housing Trust Fund to build more apartments affordable to them, in the form of preserving and expanding public housing. But we also need to recognize that we don't need to build more housing everywhere. There are some communities where there's enough supply, but the people who live in those apartments can't afford them. And so for them, we need to expand rental assistance to be that bridge between what they earn and what rent costs, and keep them stably housed as well.
So you've already broached my next question. Do you see, other than rental assistance, other ways that federal housing programs could be improved from a federal standpoint?
That the rental assistance could be improved?
Well, not only rental assistance, but housing programs overall, rental assistance being one.
Sure, yeah, the choice in, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name, Choice in Affordable Housing Act is a bipartisan bill before this committee, and it's a good example of ways that we can improve the Housing Choice Voucher Program to create more choice for tenants to be able to live in what are often called communities of opportunity, to streamline inspections and other requirements related to the program, to make the worth of a voucher more reflective of local rental costs. So yes, there's a number of ways that we can improve, and there's bipartisan support to do it.
Okay, Mr. Tisler, very quickly, as you look at urban America, you look at rural America, are the problems different? Are the solutions different?
I think the problem is the same in terms of the affordability of homes and housing in general. I think that when you look at density, that's where the solutions are different. In terms of looking at low-income tax credit properties in rural communities, it's very hard, as Diane said, in terms of being able to cover those costs, where in an urban market, it's a lot easier because of that density. So there's definitely differences, especially when looking at manufactured housing, and how manufactured housing can be the issue for many in rural communities. It can be an issue in suburban and urban communities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tester, Senator Lummis is recognized from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here. I know that Senator Scott has taken a keen interest in this subject, and his Road to Housing Act is a great framework to offer, ideas that are going to move this conversation forward on housing. Certainly supporting innovation and reducing regulatory burdens are ways we can help Americans find affordable rental housing or move into home ownership. This year has created some particular issues that normally we don't have to deal with. We've had unprecedented amounts of snow in Wyoming, so much so that the snow load on the roofs of our housing weighs so much that whole buildings are collapsing. Not issues that you encounter everywhere, but I suspect, Ms. Smith, you know what I'm talking about. It's a unique issue to some of us who are in the Intermountain area or northern climates, but there are also uniquenesses to those areas in the south that we don't encounter. Anyway, the regional perspective has to be respected on these issues and is really important. That said, I'd like to start by asking Ms. Calder a question. Welcome to the hearing. Over the last several years, the federal government has directed a tremendous amount of money towards housing, and yet I'm hearing every day from constituents, literally every day, that they're having trouble finding affordable housing. So my question is, have you done any research about what the net effect is of spending all this money on housing and having it appear not to solve the problem?
Well, I've done a little bit of research on that. A few years back, I looked at the places that HUD spending was directed, and I found that it was directed to states that have the highest level of regulation. So in places that are restrictively zoned, in places that have restrictive land use regulations, that's where the HUD subsidies were going. And I think that that is really problematic and probably, is one reason why we have this sort of situation where we're spending, billions every year. We just recently increased to $70 billion a year annually that we're spending at HUD. And at the same time, we're not seeing reductions in the number of people that are, cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And I think that that's probably why we're sort of rewarding places that have these really restrictive zoning and land use regulations that stifle housing supply, and that directly affects housing affordability.
Well, that segues into my next question, which is another uniqueness of states in the American West. Wyoming is half federal land. Utah is 2/3 federal land. Nevada is almost 7/8 federal land. And so some of our communities are landlocked by federal land, and that has placed a unique constraint on housing. So can you talk about how we could instead use federal lands to help solve the housing problem?
Absolutely. Well, I really like the bill that you co-sponsored, the Houses Act. I believe you were a co-sponsor on that bill.
Yes.
I'm really a fan of that bill, and that bill would allow local governments to nominate federal lands and purchase them and use them to develop housing at a certain housing density level. There are requirements on how dense the housing needs to be. I think that that's really valuable. I think people that don't live in the West or Intermountain West, they don't realize how much of the West and Intermountain West are federal lands, and they don't realize that most of those federal lands, no, they're not national parks, they're not national monuments, they're Bureau of Land Management land, they're land that is grazing or mining or energy producing land. And, that land is also close to city boundaries. It's close to city borders. There was a report that was published that looked at Utah specifically and found that 650,000 acres of BLM and Forest Service land were within a mile of Utah cities. And so this is not land that's far off and, hinterlands. It is close to city boundaries, and I think it could make a difference from a housing supply perspective.
Thank you. And one quick question for Mr. Tisler, because I'm about out of time. How can manufactured housing, tiny homes, and innovations help in this space?
They're definitely, again, the tool to address the supply issue. And being able to look at zoning issues to be able to get tiny homes on properties in urban communities, suburban communities need to be addressed. I think that there's answers for either senior living, family living, intergenerational living in terms of looking at manufactured housing, ADUs, and small, tiny homes on properties. And so that should be looked at as an answer to the issue.
I like your ideas about intergenerational housing. Thank you. I yield back.
Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. And, I want to agree with some of the conversations from colleagues on both sides. We do need to do regulatory streamlining and put more tools in the tool chest on how we get this right. I do think we got to deal with supply as well. And I think we've got bipartisan support on things like LIHTC, the low-income tax credit, the new market tax credit. I think Senator Cardin and our former colleague, Senator Portman, had a really interesting idea in the neighborhood homes investment tax credit. How do you take some of that older housing that happens in communities in my state, communities in the West, that needs that refurbishment to be brought back onto the marketplace? And I think we ought to be proceeding ahead on all of those, and I'll come to a question in a moment. But I also think we need to do more on home ownership. I was back in the office and heard a little bit of Senator Scott's opening comments. We have a huge racial wealth gap in this country, roughly 10-to-1 white-black ratio, a lot of that due to home ownership differentials. And I think we have to be a lot more creative. One of the things I've been working on for a while is recognizing with the current makeup of the House and the Senate, we probably are not going to get a lot of additional federal dollars for down payment assistance. But I'm working on an approach that would provide an employer-based tax credit so that an employer could give a down payment to an employee on a tax-free basis. And when we think about, for example, healthcare workers in rural communities, having that incentive where the hospital system might be able to help make that down payment in a way that would retain that employee, it helps in terms of home ownership. It also helps in terms of retention on the workforce. We also, and I'm going to come to you now, Mr. Tisler, on the question, because I think you were kind enough to mention another initiative I put forward in your opening remarks, and that's the LIFT Act, which I think is, again, self-servingly perhaps, but really creative. It says, first generation, first-time home buyers, if you could qualify for a traditional 30-year mortgage within certain income bands, the subsidy we give you would be to actually take that 30-year mortgage payment and give you a 20-year mortgage. So that first-generation, first-time home buyer still has to meet the criteria, but over 10 years literally would accumulate double the equity. Disproportionately, that would help communities of color all across, and would also help a lot of rural communities where that access to that first-time home purchase is a real mountain to climb. So with that setup, Mr. Tisler, these kind of issues of how we deal with home ownership, racial wealth gap, getting those first-generation folks of all backgrounds into a home, and whether a program like the LIFT Act might help that progress along.
Thanks, Senator. The LIFT Act is definitely one of the tools that can help that. Being able to put it together with some small dollar lending in terms of looking at $70,000 or below, looking at CDFI lending, and really marrying that together and saying, okay, first generation, you're going to accelerate your equity. And that is the right direction to go in terms of that. And the subsidy stays in there for a very long time. It is not as if it's something that could be bought and sold, in the first 5 years or so. So in terms of looking at innovative approaches of looking at things along those lines, that is really what we need from a bipartisan support to address those issues. The banks are still going to make their money, the home builders, the realtors, everybody else, but the homeowner is going to be able to build that equity, and our communities of color need things just like this to be able to move them forward.
And the fact is, if we can get, again, first generation, first time home buyers, that ability to build equity twice, that then helps in terms of the ability to not get deep in debt when your kid needs to go to college, because you've got the equity that you can draw down upon. You mentioned my other favorite buzz term, and beyond buzz term, CDFIs. Mm-hmm. One of the things that, again, share with my Republican colleagues, Actually, under President Trump, we got $12 billion into CDFI lending. Again, for low and moderate income lending across the country. And we need to do a better job of creating a secondary market. Of that $12 billion, $3 billion went for grants, $9 billion went as Tier 1 equity into these institutions. This is a part of our overall financial system that needs more attention. I'm glad that we've been able to create a CDFI caucus, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats here in the Senate. And I know a number of my colleagues, Senator Smith in particular, has worked on CDFI issues. I'd welcome particularly some of my newer colleagues, that we might work on CDFIs. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And if we could create that secondary market for some of these CDFI loans and bespoke programs, I think we go a long way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warren. Senator Vance from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to direct some questions about housing first to Ms. Calder and to Ms. Yentel. And I want to sort of introduce this by, when I was a kid, we had a neighbor move in next door to us, actually, and I live with my grandmother. And, she was a particularly troubled person, suffered with some serious substance abuse problems. And I remember one case in particular where she called the landlord, who was actually a family friend of ours, because before she moved in, this person lived there, and said, I've got a leaky ceiling problem. And the guy showed up and investigated, and the woman had passed out. She was on drugs on the bottom floor, and on the top floor, she had set a bath to run, and what had caused the leaky ceiling and, in fact, destroy the entire upper level of the house was that she had set a bath and then gotten high and passed out. And I think it illustrates a particular problem with some of the approaches that we've taken to homelessness and housing, where we tend to want to address so-called housing first without addressing the root causes of homelessness. And I worry about this in this particular context because whether it's in our urban communities or in our rural communities, if we don't treat the root cause of homelessness, we end up creating cycles of despair where even when you get women like this into a good home, ultimately it can be very destructive and not ultimately solve the very problem that we're trying to solve. So I guess the very first question I ask first to Ms. Calder is, do you think that we should allow people who have serious substance abuse problems, should we be giving them housing without any preconditions on substance abuse counseling, therapy, and so forth?
Look, I think that the homeless population is a diverse population. And
Sure.
so from my perspective, it doesn't make sense to have a one-size-fits-all policy. I think Housing First is it's an idea that has been adopted pretty rigidly in places like California. There are complaints in California from shelters that are, women and children shelters only, and they say, look, we can't get any state funding for our homeless efforts here, but we're doing a really important job here. We need to, have rules around substance use, and the reason for that is that these women that come into this shelter, a lot of times they're fighting for custody. They want to secure custody of their kids, and it's hard to do that in an environment where people are using substances. So I think that there should be, I think we should let all different types of homeless approaches, bloom and have a lot of diversity in that regard. And I think that unfortunately Housing First has been adopted in some places and that diversity has been sort of squelched.
Yeah, I just want to build on that before turning to you, Ms. Yentel. So as I understand it, the problem with Housing First is precisely the one-fits-all approach. In other words, you can take housing programs that are attempting to treat the root cause of homelessness, but then you're denying them federal funds if they're not following the so-called Housing First approach. And I guess, Ms. Yentel, I just asked directly, do you agree with that approach? And I'd love to hear why or why not.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator Vance. First, the root cause of homelessness, the one thing that all people experiencing homelessness have in common is lack of access to a decent, stable, affordable home. And the research and the evidence are very clear that if people have substance abuse challenges or mental illness, they are best able to address those challenges from a stable home. So low barrier Housing First approaches that get people into affordable, stable homes and then provide them with voluntary supportive services as necessary is shown again and again in the research and the evidence to be the most effective way to address homelessness. And there are a number of examples in your state of Ohio, very successful Housing First programs that work with people experiencing homelessness who don't have substance abuse or mental health challenges and those who do. And in both cases, it's the housing first approach, that low barrier approach to getting somebody stably housed first that works. We tried sobriety requirements back in the 80s and the 90s. As a country, that was our approach to addressing homelessness. We had a stair-step model where people had to prove that they were so-called housing ready. It didn't work, and it was overly expensive.
So let me just a couple points on that, Ms. Yentel. So first of all, it's interesting to contrast the 80s and 90s with where we are today, because while we've been trying a housing first based approach for the past few years in this country, as I understand it, we're spending about 200% more on providing homes to the homeless, 200% more on homeless support than we were when we weren't trying housing first. And yet, simultaneously, the homeless population in the country has gone up 20%. So it strikes me as a very bad deal for the American taxpayer, but more importantly for the homeless, if we're spending twice as much or more, and yet we've seen the homeless problem get worse in this country. I think a related point, I know I'm short on time here, so I'll yield after just making this point, is I really worry about the social contagion effect on this, because it's not, of course, just the homeless people themselves who are affected, but it's the people they share a neighborhood or people they share a building complex with. And I really worry that what Housing First has done is taken a lot of people who are very much struggling and very much deserving of our compassion, though I think how we provide that compassion is up for debate. But it also introduces people with serious drug problems, serious mental illness problems into communities with kids who are already in a very unstable situation, and now they're having things like drug use normalized around them. And that's certainly what you see in some of the neighborhoods where you have people moving in who are struggling in very significant ways. Sometimes those behaviors can become normalized to the kids around them. And I worry about that. And I worry that the Housing First approach is focusing just on the homeless population and failing, by the way, but also it's ignoring a lot of the kids who are affected by this Housing First approach. Again, if Housing First is working, why isn't it working? The homeless problem is getting worse.
Sure.
Time to answer that?
Go on, Ms. Yentel. Yeah, that's fine. Go on, Ms. Yentel.
So again, with respect, and the evidence and the data are so clear that Housing First does work. We know, and it works in your state of Ohio. We know how to end homelessness. In fact, individuals have their homelessness ended every day in Ohio and throughout the country. What we can't do is stem the tide of people newly falling into homelessness as rents increase much faster than incomes do. And to the point of mental illness and substance abuse and contagion, I would just say that there are many people who are safely housed who suffer from mental illness and substance abuse. And I think we don't hear the same concerns about contagion raised there. It's because their substance abuse isn't as public because they have the ability to close their door at night and get the services and resources that they need while they're housed. I would love to also just note that there are many different types of people experiencing homelessness, and actually the majority of people who do experience homelessness are working households or households who have struggled with being able to make ends meet as rents skyrocket and the cost of their incomes does not meet the increased rent as well. So there's a lot. I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you and to introduce you to some of the Housing First providers in Ohio who could share with you their success with the program.
Thanks, Senator. And thank you, Ms. Yentel. Senator Warren of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So our country faces a shortage of over 7 million homes, and families across this country in cities and suburbs and rural areas have seen their rents and their mortgage payments skyrocket. Addressing this challenge is going to take major federal investment to expand the supply of housing. And the longer we hold out on this, the harder it's going to be to solve this problem and help families. Today, though, I want to focus on one piece of the problem, the housing crisis in Indian country. In 2018, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights published a report called Broken Promises, which found that the federal government has woefully underfunded programs for Native people across the board in healthcare, in education, in public safety, and yes, in housing. The barriers that tribes face in accessing existing federal resources has compounded the housing challenges for families living on tribal lands. Ms. Yentel, your organization, NLIHC, has done extensive research on our country's affordable housing needs, including the housing needs in Indian country. Can I ask you just to describe the current state of tribal housing?
Yes, thank you, Senator Warren. Families in tribal communities have some of the worst housing needs in the country. They are 5 times more likely to live in deep poverty and in poor housing conditions than the general population. They are 5 times more likely to live in homes that lack indoor plumbing. They're 4 times more likely to live in homes that lack a refrigerator, a sink, or a stove. They're much more likely to have heating issues in their homes as well. And overcrowding and homelessness is also a significant challenge in tribal lands. About 16% of tribal families in tribal communities live in overcrowded housing, compared to about 2% in the general population.
So thank you for your research on this. This is just an incredibly bleak picture. A 2017 HUD report found that at least 68,000 new units, and that's probably an underestimate, are needed to address substandard and overcrowded housing conditions on tribal lands. And yet federal funding for tribal housing programs that are critical for developing new housing, for performing essential upkeep on existing homes that are falling apart, and for keeping families in homes has all stagnated. We need to build more housing. We need to build better housing in Indian country to ensure that the federal government lives up to its trust and treaty responsibilities. Now, one place we could start is by ensuring that Indian country can access the full array of federal programs that support affordable development and preservation, particularly in rural areas. And that is why I am introducing a bill to guarantee that tribes receive at least 5% of the rural housing resources provided by the United States Department of Agriculture. Ms. Yentel, would my bill help address the housing challenges that families face on tribal lands today?
It would. The tribal communities that have the most significant housing challenges tend to be those that are rural and remote, in the plains, in the Southwest, in Alaska. And one of the challenges that they face is that they're not able to access other resources from federal departments, in part because the population of those tribes is often undercounted, and so they're not able to get the resources that actually they're entitled to and certainly need. So your bill would certainly help ensure that some of these poorest communities with the greatest housing needs could access a whole array of resources that could help with development in their communities.
Thank you. That is a really important point you made. You know, there's a clear need not only for additional federal housing resources on tribal lands, but also ensuring that the tribal nations can access these resources in the first place. And that's what this bill is all about. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to get this bill passed and to start making good on our nation's promise to Native people. I want to close with one last point in my remaining seconds here. Today's hearing is about bipartisan solutions to this country's housing challenges, and my bill does this without adding any new funding. But we know what addressing the housing crisis across this country is going to take: more federal investment to build more homes. And yet, we have too many Republicans who have said they will not support meaningful housing investments. In fact, we have Republicans now who are threatening to default on our national debt unless they can get cuts to housing resources, among other vital programs they're trying to cut. So I hope my colleagues will come to the table, get serious about doing what we need to do to solve the housing crisis for American families. It is important that we do this, and it is important in red states, blue states, everywhere in America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Britt from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Senator Vance's line of questioning, Mrs. Calder, that he did not get to finish with time permitting. Last month, we had a subcommittee hearing about the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. Among other things, we were told that specifically from Biden administration housing policies, if you look at the Housing First initiatives and those policies, that they were working, and some of the people before us were advocating for those. But in an article that you wrote in February of this year, you suggested that these same policies with a hefty price tag often do not accomplish the goal of combating homelessness. In fact, you stated that the year that California implemented the Housing First statewide, from 2016 to 2022, chronic homelessness actually increased by 93%. Mrs. Calder, in your opinion, has the Housing First strategy been successful enough to justify the hefty price tag?
So I would say no in general. Now, I think, earlier Diane mentioned that Housing First, it just works. The research just says that it works. I think we have to be really careful about what do we mean by works? If we mean by ends chronic homelessness, if we mean reduces chronic homelessness, this is what most people think of when they think of Housing First working or a homeless policy working. Now, does it end homelessness for some of the beneficiaries, for the beneficiaries that receive those permanent housing subsidies? I think you can argue that yes, for them it does. But in terms of big picture, is it reducing the number of homeless people, the number of chronically homeless people? That's the group that it targets specifically. The answer, at least in 2 of the places that it's been adopted, is resoundingly no, based on the data. In Utah is actually the first place to adopt Housing First back in 2005. And in Utah, homelessness has increased by 93%. You mentioned California, where it's increased by 95%. In Houston, Texas, we have a little bit of a different situation where actually they adopted, so adding some nuance into the conversation, they've adopted Housing First, and actually they have reduced homelessness there. I think that Houston is a pretty unique situation. Houston has a variety of different things going for it, one of which is that it lacks a traditional zoning code, has a very pro-development culture, has a very responsive housing supply. We know that zoning regulations, having relatively more zoning regulations, is associated with having a greater degree of homelessness. So I think that that's something that other places could look at as something that would bolster their efforts at rental assistance and at homeless policy.
Earlier this year, we had economist Dr. Diaz, and he discussed the regulatory burden in home building before this very committee. According to the National Association of Home Builders, over 40% of multifamily development costs come from government regulations. If one of our goals here is to increase housing affordability, then the answer seems clear. We have to fix the overly burdensome regulatory environment. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yes.
Can you briefly discuss some of the land use regulatory obstacles and how they're affecting housing prices, please?
Yes, there are so many obstacles. Honestly, it is such a pervasive problem. I think most people really don't know. I studied urban planning for my undergraduate degree, so I'm very familiar with all of the various urban land use and zoning regulations that affect development. They affect every element of development. They're some of the worst from a housing supply perspective. Regulations are things like minimum lot sizes. In some places, these require that homeowners buy lots that are 1 acre or 2 acres or more even. Obviously, that's not going to be affordable if you want to put down a tiny home or a little modular unit or something. That is going to undercut the economics of doing something like that. There are also things like parking regulations that really push up the cost of rent. There was a study that found that parking requirements push up the cost of rent by 17% for renters. That's a really significant regulation as well. But anything that relates to density, that limits density, certainly just broad single-family home zoning that doesn't allow anything but single-family homes to be built is something that limits density very restrictively. And so that's something that a lot of states and local governments are looking at reforming now. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Brett. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I think we all agree that we are facing an affordable housing crisis in the country, and it's based both on a lack of supply overall, but also, I believe, the lack of enough support for affordable housing from the federal level. And we need action on all levels. As you just said, Ms. Calder, the local component of this is important, restrictive zoning. At the state level, they have an important role to play. At the federal level, we're looking at options for the federal government on a bipartisan basis to address some of the issues. And Senator Young and I have been working for years on a bipartisan bill called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. We just reintroduced that bill yesterday because the chairman and the ranking member have been looking for bipartisan options to address some of these issues. This bill would provide 250,000 mobility vouchers to families with young children. And so in addition to providing more affordable housing options, research from Rod Shetty and others has demonstrated that this also has the benefit of allowing families to move to areas of opportunity, areas with good schools, safe neighborhoods. So if you could, Ms. Yentel, you and your coalition have been working on this for a very long time. We're appreciative of your efforts. If you and then Mr. Tisler could just talk about why this would be an important bipartisan initiative, assuming you agree.
Absolutely. Senator Van Hollen, we're so thrilled for your leadership and thankful for your leadership, and so glad to have this important bipartisan legislation reintroduced this Congress. I really urge this committee and this Congress to move it forward quickly. Housing choice vouchers generally are proven effective at addressing and ending homelessness, housing instability, displacement, highly effective tool. And making more vouchers available to families with young children then has exponential positive impact for those families and those kids. As you said, Raj Chetty's research, really groundbreaking research, made clear the long-term, over a child's lifetime, the long-term positive impact that can come when that family has an ability to live in a neighborhood with higher performing schools, better access to transportation, higher paying jobs, et cetera. There's tremendous positive benefit for those children, for the families, for the community, and really over time for the country, because savings are found when we have such positive effects. So this legislation would really significantly address family homelessness and housing instability for households and communities across the country, and we urge its quick passage.
Thank you. Mr. Tisler?
Senator Van Hollen, thank you very much. Just want to say that there's some incredible NeighborWorks organizations in your state, NHS of Baltimore being one of them, that are really looking into this in terms of looking at vouchers and things along those lines. Being able to have families in high opportunity neighborhoods is incredibly important. It increases the health, education, and economic well-being of those families. And so being able to use these vouchers to go into high opportunity neighborhoods will be of benefit for everybody. People talk about the benefits of mixed income. This is a bill that will actually show that it actually works. And so we're looking forward to supporting you and others in terms of making this happen, because everybody should have that opportunity, and this allows that to happen.
Thank you. Ms. Calder, I don't know if you have any comment on these. These are affordable housing vouchers, especially designed with some wraparound services to help families with young kids, which is why I think it's been a bipartisan initiative. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you. Yes, I like tenant-based assistance. I like tenant-based vouchers. I think that it's a superior option as compared with supply-side or production subsidies. And a lot of the reason why it is a superior option is because it allows for the mobility, economic mobility, geographic mobility, and it helps to avoid these concentrations of poverty that we get with other programs like public housing, like the low-income housing tax credit. There's a lot of research to support that has just come out recently. So I think that the focus should be on moving towards tenant-based rental assistance. I guess I would just prefer that various supply side or production side subsidies that aren't being effectively used right now, they could be repurposed towards tenant-based assistance.
Got it.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Senator Kramer of North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. And Ms. Yentel, I want to start with you because first of all, the chairman was kind to highlight Senator Coons and my the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. You highlighted it in a response to Senator Tester earlier, so I want to give you an opportunity to expand on it a little bit more. This is legislation that Senator Coons and I introduced last session, reintroduced it. Good bipartisan support from the committee and former committee members. Senator Smith is on it, Senator Warnock, Senator Tillis, Moran. And basically what we do is we offer PHA's opportunity to offer security or deposit assistance to tenants, and then a signing bonus to the landlord as well, with a unit in an area that is in demand or in need. I think it's an area with less than 20% poverty if the unit's in that area. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the importance of the legislation, which you've done already to a degree, and then specifically how would the changes that are proposed in the bill specifically strengthen existing housing choice opportunities and the voucher program that you're just talking about?
Yes, thank you, Senator Kramer, and thank you for reintroducing this important bipartisan legislation. The bill would, as the name implies, increase the ability for tenants who have housing choice vouchers to choose where to live based on what's best for themselves and their families. And it increases choice in a couple of ways. One, through increasing landlord participation in the program, which has been decreasing in recent years and is obviously an essential part of the program working.
Which is what inspired me to try to get on this bill and improve it.
Yeah, so the incentives you mentioned can increase landlord participation. The bill would also streamline and simplify some of the requirements around the program, especially the inspection process, which may also bring more landlords to the table. And it also increases choice for the tenant by making the worth of the voucher more reflective of the local market where they want to rent through implementing small area FMRs. That would also be a significant change, an important change, an improvement to the overall program.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, again, when Senator Coons first came to me with it, I like the idea of vouchers. I like the idea of dealing with the demand side, but a demand side without a supply side, or with inadequate balance of incentives, really doesn't do a heck of a lot of good. So that was, I think, the balance, at least that I was trying to strike. I want to just spend a couple minutes here or wrap up, going back to the topic that Senator Tillis raised with regard to this very perverse ruling from Federal Housing Finance Agency on mortgages. And I want to underscore one of the things that's so ironic to me in their proposal, that somehow people with a higher credit score would be subsidizing people with a lower credit score, presuming that you're helping people at the lower income level. And I want to underscore that it's a proposal that incorrectly assumes that people with a higher credit score are naturally people with more money. The two aren't necessarily hand in hand. If we're going to have some sort of an incentive like that, well, first of all, I think it's a really awful idea that you would punish the high performers this way. But it's even crazier when you consider that the high performers are oftentimes people like my parents were, never above middle class, and but always paid their bills. Probably had a great credit score by today's standards if they were alive today. The idea that somehow they would have to subsidize somebody who makes 3 times as much money just because their credit score was better than that person just makes zero sense to me. So I hope they rethink this whole crazy proposal. Ms. Brown-Calder, do you want to comment a little bit back on the, since I have 35 seconds left, on the previous topic of the vouchers and how the incentives on the landlord side may may either help or you may disagree?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think from what I've heard, speaking to organizations that try to secure these vouchers for tenants, what I've heard from them is that in a lot of cases, the landlords, it's not that they don't want to do this good thing of providing space for these tenants, it's that they don't want to work with HUD. There's too much, I guess, bureaucracy, checking, paperwork, whatever, what have you. And so rather than work with HUD, in some cases, down in Houston, what they've done is actually landlords have just given away their unit. They just say, we'd rather just give this to you than work with HUD. So I think that, rather than trying to incentivize landlords to take this kind of bonus money, it would be really good to look into what are those underlying reasons that landlords are worried about dealing with HUD to begin with and see if there's a way to reform some of those.
Well, I think the bill does do some of that. It does incentivize, it streamlines some of the inspection process, things like that. So we're trying to find a balance both on the supply and the demand side. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing. It is so important. Obviously, housing, affordable housing in all of our communities is essential. And let me just start by saying thank you to all of my colleagues in the bipartisan work that we are talking about, both on the Choice and Affordable Housing Act that we've been talking about today, as well as the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. You know, in Nevada, we've made several changes to encourage landlords to accept vouchers. So I want to thank my colleagues on both sides for the work that they're doing here. Housing, affordable housing. In my community, in my state, we have statewide coalitions, state, local, federal, we all work together because housing is about not just homelessness, it's about workforce housing, it's about senior housing, it's about veterans housing. It's a number of things that we need to address to ensure that at all levels, people can afford to have that home. And the challenge I have in my state is all of the above. And it starts, part of that is on building affordable housing so we can keep the costs low. The other part is what we've talked about is so that the individuals that have housing, whether they want to be owners or renters, they can do that, right? And so how does the federal government play a role in both of those? In the West, in Nevada, when we're building housing, it starts with the land. And so I so appreciate Senator Lamas' concerns and talk about, at the federal level, one of our key partners, unlike the rest of the country, is the federal government, because they own most of the land. In my state, it's over 80%. So they have to be essential partners when we're identifying the land to build, hopefully, affordable housing, because that's where it starts. What's the cost of the land to add to this? And so any work that we can do to address and bring the federal government as part of it, reduce the bureaucracy, is going to be key to this affordable housing. I want to talk about one of the pieces of legislation that I have introduced, which is really to reauthorize the Home Investment Partnerships Program. I know, Mr. Tisler, you were asked about this earlier. HOME is the largest affordable housing block grant. As you all know, it was first authorized in 1990. My bill would update the HOME program. Some changes would include improved access for community land trusts so that we can recycle the subsidy, curb recapture penalties for homeownership assistance when a service member is deployed or a recipient dies, and allow local governments to leverage future funds by providing a loan guarantee opportunity with home funds. This is similar to the Community Development Block Grant Program. My bill also reduces the duplicative inspection requirements, removes the requirement property owners with 1 to 4 units maintain a wait list, and makes it easier for community housing development organizations to retain an operational board, and among other changes. So there's a lot to it to try to figure out how we make this do away with the bureaucracy. How does it work as part of the system? And so, Mr. Tisler, let me just ask you this. The legislation I worked on, because I have a lot of service members in my state as well, the proposal I have in my bill would allow service members to receive down payment assistance without fear of recapture if they were deployed somewhere else. Can you talk a little bit why that is important?
Thank you, Senator. And we're so looking forward to the home reauthorization and the modernization and everything else that you're looking for here. But when we have service members that are going out to protect our country, we should not have to penalize them in terms of leaving their home. And the federal government needs to work together across interagencies to make sure it's not just the home program, but other programs too, that when people are deployed, there's not a penalty for that. And so our organizations, not just in Nevada, but across the country, support what you're doing in terms of this in a bipartisan way to look at our service members.
Thank you. And then let me jump to manufactured housing, because we've talked a little bit about that, but I think this is key for the conversation we're having here. In Nevada, about 6% of families live in manufactured housing. Some own the land under their homes, but others rent, and renting a lot in a community can lead to high lot rents, evictions, or sale of the community. We were able, in the last appropriations bill, to include legislation that I introduced to create a new grant program to help manufactured home communities. This program, which is the Preservation and Reinvestment Initiative for Community Enhancement, would provide funds to improve infrastructure, add or upgrade tornado shelters, improve roads, sewer, and water, and also provide funds to replace outdated mobile homes. Mr. Tisler, let me start with you. Why should Congress prioritize the needs of residents of manufactured home communities?
Senator, I'll use the acronym PRICE. That way I don't take a lot of the time. But in terms of manufactured housing, it is very important because it's the answer to many rural areas. Nonprofit resident-owned communities are important to be able to make sure that the rents aren't going up, that they're not being captured by these institutional investors. And so manufactured housing has the ability to increase supply in an affordable way. And I think that moving in that direction has that answer to be able to do that. And, we have organizations that talk about energy efficiency, and it's not for the greening, the climate perspective, it's about the green in their wallets. And that's what really happens with this energy efficiency kind of rehab and things along those lines that are happening in the bill for manufactured housing. So it looks at the holistic point of people's wallets so they can make sure that they're able to make their payments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks also to our panelists. I've really enjoyed this conversation and hearing your very substantive responses to all of our questions. I think that I hear, Mr. Chair, that there is a significant amount of bipartisan agreement on how we might approach this and a clear understanding that we have a supply problem. And I want to just take an opportunity to mention that next week in the Housing Subcommittee that I chair, we're going to be talking about the bill that I've been working on with Senator Rounds to modernize and improve the Rural Housing Service, which is a very important USDA strategy for preserving and expanding access to affordable housing in rural communities. And I think it touches on a lot of the themes that we've been talking about today about taking federal programs that don't work quite like they should. They're actually really cumbersome for property owners as well as renters to use and modernize it and make it work better. So I'm looking forward to that subcommittee hearing with my ranking member, Cynthia Lummis, and I know that it'll be a good hearing, and I'm hoping to move that bill forward, Mr. Chair, in the full committee as well. But let me just, there's been a lot of conversation. I want to shift to talking a bit about this interesting discussion around zoning and what we need to do around addressing the cost burden that zoning has on affordable housing. And I want to tell a bit of a story about Minneapolis. So Minneapolis has really been a strong leader in tackling the ways, getting rid of exclusionary zoning practices. And here's an example of the kind of project that we're able to do because of that reform at the local level. I went to a groundbreaking 84 new, more denser, affordable units, scattered site all over the city. So now no longer in Minneapolis can you say you can't, you have only some parts of the city that are only single family. We've changed that zoning so that these scattered site units can be built. It's a public-private partnership with some federal dollars, local and state dollars, but a lot of private, but also, a partnership. Modular construction, so as you're talking about, Senator Cortez Masto, some innovations in construction that make it more affordable. And we're using IRA tax credits to help lower energy costs for the folks that are going to be living in those units. So to me, this is an example of the kind of thing that we ought to be able to do more when we have some innovation and reform in local zoning. Still going to be just as safe as they would have been before. We're not sacrificing, as you said, I think, Ms. Calder, we don't need to sacrifice health and safety in order to do the zoning reforms that we want to do. So let me just ask really anybody on the panel, as you think about those kinds of strategies like my hometown of Minneapolis is deploying to make it easier to build affordable housing in urban communities, if you've seen other examples like this and anything else you think our committee should be aware of as we think about these bipartisan bills.
I'm happy to jump in. Since this is an issue that really excites me, Minneapolis really did lead the way on zoning reform. It's really true. I think, Minneapolis came first, made huge changes from, away from single-family zoning and towards duplexes, triplexes, as I recall. And that was really big, and other places followed, including California. California's made a lot of reforms recently, so we're still kind of waiting to see how some of those reforms that are just really recent have turned out. But I guess as far as other examples of places that have made successful reforms, ADUs have come up a couple of times. That's one place that we really have seen success already in the reforms that have been made in California, as an example, in Seattle, Washington as well, where the number of ADUs that have been permitted have multiplied 3.5 times in Seattle since their reform in 2019, and 11 times in California since their reform. So I think that that's something that is an easy kind of low stakes reform if you're looking for sort of initial introductory type zoning reforms that can be made in a lot of places across the country.
Ms. Calder, I appreciated what you said about how also you need to take a comprehensive approach if you want to get the kind of impact that you that we're talking about. Ms. Yentel, let me just go to you quickly. Minneapolis is also a community that has some of the worst wealth disparities between black families and white families, and some of the greatest segregation as a result of the kind of exclusionary zoning that we have had for so many years. This would be a way of, I think, maybe trying to overcome some of that. Could you talk about the relationship between equity and these local zoning rules?
Yes, very often local zoning ordinances that restrict multifamily housing from being developed in communities that are primarily single-family housing have at their root exclusion. They are exclusionary zoning policies, and they exacerbate segregation and racial inequities. And reducing local zoning ordinances that prevent multifamily housing from being built where communities want to live continues those racial inequities. So it's very important that states and localities address them. To the point of what other positive zoning changes are needed, I think we can just look to the bipartisan Yes in My Backyard Act, the YIMBY Act, which really lists out all of the changes that can be made at the state and local level. And that bill itself sounds like very strong bipartisan support, and we should certainly move that forward, and we should go further to actually incentivize and require states and localities to make these changes by tying changes to federal dollars.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Smith, Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tisler, thanks for being here. And I know you've mentioned and are familiar with whole home repairs in your testimony. And I mean, I'm really excited by it because here in Pennsylvania, one of my friends really separated it. Nikhil Seva. He was one of the quite literally one of the as hard left of a politician I'm aware of. Certainly in the Senate. Was really helped shepherd that. And he got linked up with the Republicans, and they actually created the first kind of a program like this in the nation, And one of my colleagues, Mr. Vance, talked about, well, if there's a lick in the sending, well, what if you don't have the money to fix that? What can happen to that kind of things? And I come from a community now in Braddock, Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of your home can go bad quickly if you weren't having those kinds. And so, I mean, I'm a big, I'm incredibly, I think I'm excited that could take from Pennsylvania and go federal. And what else do you think it would be? You think it would be if that was be able to make that federal?
Thank you, Senator. I would just say the whole homes repair program is something that we're incredibly excited about. NeighborWorks Northeastern Pennsylvania, working with Wayne County in Pennsylvania, did an incredible job. But I think in terms of looking at some of the senators who said, what about snow on my roof? What about the rain that's coming and things along those lines? If you don't address those issues, your house will dilapidate, deferred maintenance goes down, you then start that whole broken window syndrome. In terms of leading to blight, to leading to crime, to leading to others. So being able to have a national home repair program would be incredible. In Cleveland, 20 years ago, it was, if you build a 4-unit townhome, that was the greatest thing in the world. But the other 14,000 structures that were there, they needed to be addressed too. And so I think that the whole homes repair program is incredible.
Yeah, I've seen it happen again and again, that a simple leak, which is a cancer for a home. If there's a leak in the roof, it can go dilapidated, rapidly. And if you don't have the money to fix it, then that happens. And then that only exacerbates the supply issue that you guys were just talking about in before. I'm excited about this. And be working with Senator Casey, of course, in our state, because we really want to expand on that success, here in Pennsylvania. So,
Senator Fetterman, can I add one of the parts of the legislation that I really appreciate is the loans, forgivable loans to multifamily property owners, and I appreciate how the legislation would have some requirements of those landlords, if the loan is to be forgiven, that they establish important tenant protections, like protections against exorbitant rent hikes, allowing for leases to be extended for 3 years, and also requiring that those landlords accept Section 8 vouchers. I think that's a really important model to set for new federal programs to have those kind of ties for tenant protections for any kind of new benefits for property owners and landlords.
thank you for your witnesses today, for being here today and providing a testimony. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due for a week from today, on Wednesday, May the 3rd. To the witnesses, you have 45 days to respond to any of those questions. Thank you again. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you for coming.